Started on our call. Welcome to the Next Century Cities September members call. I'm happy to share that Next Century Cities now has 118 cities and counties across the country, representing in excess of 23 million citizens. And a network at the Broadband Communities Conference was wonderful. We'll have audio tapes of those panels on the site very soon. We do have another event coming up on Monday in Portland, Maine. If you haven't registered and are interested, just get in touch with me. If you have not yet applied, please do. Quite a few of our cities have. The process is pretty easy. It's a one-page Google form. You can apply with an established plan or you can apply with a promising plan. And we're giving the awards in both categories. So now to today's call, just a few housekeeping details. Please note that we will be muting all participants other than the speakers in order to limit ambient noise. However, we really hope for participation, so you are welcome to use the chat box at the bottom to send us a question. You can send the question either to the group or just to me or just to Brendan or just to Chris, but we'll make sure the question gets asked on your behalf. So we're here today to discuss an important topic, special access. The issue has been a concern for the FCC for over 10 years, but now they are preparing to take action. There are 2 videos on this issue that are on our resources page that should be helpful, and I encourage you to take a look at those. Our goal at Next Century Cities is to ensure you're aware of such high-impact issues and that we provide you with information regarding the avenues you may have to take actions on concerns that impact your community. So I'm going to pass this over to Chris Mitchell, the Next Century Cities Policy Director and the Director of the Community Broadband Networks for the Institute of Local Self-Reliance. He's our moderator, and I'm going to hand it to him so he can introduce our participants and get the conversation started.
Thank you, Deb. Once again, we're going to be doing this call with a very high-energy sort of approach in which we'll encourage people to speak, concisely, and then give up the mic as it is, and we'll go back and forth with a lot of comments from people rather than more longer, sustained comments. This is an issue. It's called special access, a word or a term that really doesn't get at the incredible importance that it has for all kinds of telecommunications. One thing that I've followed for years is how people in more rural areas can connect to the wider internet, because you can build really great networks locally, but you have to get back to the internet. And a lot of times to do that, you have to request one of these special access circuits. And I can tell you that in a time when other people are paying $5 or $10 a megabit, people in rural California and San Diego County were paying $90 a megabit. So we're talking about rates that can be as high as 10, 20, 50 times greater than what is being paid on average, or being paid in areas where there's not a lot of competition and there's not a lot of oversight in this area. So this is incredibly important. It's something that some people have been talking about for well over a decade, but it's urgent right now because the FCC has an opportunity to do something about it. And quite honestly, if they don't do something now, we're not quite sure that they'll ever do anything. So we want to make sure that our cities are available, that they know what's happening, and that we can weigh in, because this is a matter that's been more specialized in the past. We're going to start with some little introductions, talking about why this is important individually to each of our panelists, and then we're going to go into a greater discussion of what the issue actually is, and we'll be ending with a larger discussion of what options are available for you to take action, and that's something that we'll be helping you with as we get there, basically. I'm going to start off by introducing Charles McKee, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Federal and State Regulatory. It just ends with Federal and State Regulatory. I'm going to say Federal and State Regulation for Sprint. Welcome, and could you please tell us a little bit about your background and most importantly, why, when you're someone of great stature that could be doing many different things, why are you interested in working on this issue?
Thanks very much, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to talk about a subject that does sound obscure but is critically important to the economy as a whole. I have been with Sprint for almost 20 years now, working on every type of regulatory and legal issue confronting the company. But by far, this is one of the most critical for Sprint, because these are the basic building blocks that we build networks with. This is how we provide services to large institutions, to businesses, enterprise customers throughout the United States, and it is also the way in which we provide mobile broadband services. So in many ways, our ability to increase the speed and availability of the mobile networks that people are increasingly dependent upon is based upon our ability to get access to these building blocks of the network. And as you said, this is a critical time because the Commission is at long last ready to look at concrete data and reach some decisions. So we're very excited that we might actually be able to reach a data-based, data-driven decision in a really important area for the company.
Great, thank you. And I think, just to be clear, is one of the most substantial challenges of upgrading your wireless network getting these connections to the poles, to the towers?
Yes, that is a fundamental part. So to give you a little bit of context, probably, well, not probably, we know that 1/3 of the operating costs of running a tower is the cost of these facilities that we use to connect our towers back to our network. So in order for us to provide more robust coverage and to provide faster speed, and I'm going to struggle to not get wonky on you, but I'll try not to get into the details. But to get higher speeds in mobile networks, you have to have more and smaller cell sites, down to very small cell sites that can actually be installed on a street light, for example. And every one of those needs a connection back to the network. And without those, we can't densify our networks and we can't increase the speed of our mobile networks.
Excellent. Well, I think here we have already, an important lesson that we've come back to time and time again on these calls, which is that, we're talking about, in many cases, wired connections here, but it has an impact on just about everything, including how our mobile networks work. So we're going to move on to our second panelist, Maura Corbett, who is the CEO and founder of the Glen Echo Group, which provides communications and coalition building around telecom and internet issues. And I can say that Maura is someone that I often associate with innovation. She's when they're looking for who they're going to work with, a lot of times they're very focused on encouraging innovation. So, Maura, I'd like to ask you the same question. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your background and why, when there's so many things you could work on, you could probably spend your whole life doing nothing but network neutrality. Why are you working on special access? And you may be on mute.
I was saying all these wonderful things about you, but I won't repeat them. I was thanking you for such a lovely introduction, and to you and Deb for allowing us to talk about this and for your interest in it yourselves, because I suppose I've been working on it for more than 10 years, maybe because I'm a masochist. And I worked with it all the way back to the 90s when I was at MCI. So this has, and I hope that some people on the phone still remember MCI. It is a bear of an issue precisely because it is so difficult to understand. And unfortunately, those entities who control these connections are able to leverage that to, keep control over it and keep anybody who tries to put a nose under the tent. Sorry, I saw the Pope today, so I'm a little bit flustered, so please excuse me. So they're able to use the difficulty in the legal side and on the technical side from getting anybody to pay attention to it. So because it's so complicated and it happens so deep under the radar, and it is so deeply regulatory, that they've sort of gotten away with nobody noticing what has really become their giant slush fund. So I have certainly seen it from the competitive side for a long time. But when in this quest for data on this market really has impressed upon me how big a problem this was, because they stopped collecting data on it in 2007, and it was already pretty bad then. It was about 80% controlled by AT&T and Verizon, and the overcharges every year were upwards of $10 billion. So that's $10 billion being sucked out of the economy, usually from those who need it most. You talk about innovation and entrepreneurship and economic development. Broadband has become as essential as you guys know better than any, because you're trying to get it to your cities. It's as important as electricity and roads, and it is the infrastructure of our economy now. So getting a broadband connection is not a nice to have anymore. It's a must-have. And we understand better, as Chris said, it took us 10 years to make people or to tell the story of net neutrality in the last mile to homes. It's even harder to explain how they connect banks, airlines, schools, libraries, hospitals, taking traffic from Charles cell towers back to the network. I mean, it's sort of the plumbing of the internet, which is, sort of how I think of it in my mind. And if you can't get it, you can't innovate it. And you can't innovate. And if your cities can't get it, your cities can't grow, and your anchor institutions can't thrive. We have, and I'm violating Chris's rule by talking too much. What we have done
a little bit more.
I'll just say that what we have done is there is nothing special about special access. So we're not even calling it that anymore. All it is a dedicated broadband line. And so the same problems in competition that net neutrality was about and data roaming was about and all of these other issues, it's the same disease, and that is a lack of competition. And that's what we have to solve.
Excellent. And I detect a bit of that passion of supporting the underdog, which in many cases I think our cities are.
Absolutely.
So now we're going to turn to Harold Feld, our third panelist. Harold is the Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge, an organization in Washington, D.C. that does a lot of work on telecommunications and innovation in areas. And I have to say that if you have any interest in sort of geek culture or Star Trek, anything like that, you should be reading Harold's blog. He writes regularly a blog called Tales from the Sausage Factory on a website called Wet Machine, and it ties in a lot of these policy issues into geek culture. There's a lot of fun references here and there, as well as the threat of learning something. So welcome to the show, Harold. Welcome to our discussion. Why don't you give us a little bit background on yourself and why you care about this issue?
Okay, so I'm at an organization called Public Knowledge. We're a digital rights advocacy group. For a lot about making sure that affordable broadband is available to everyone, and generally protecting people's right to communicate and benefit from new technologies. For us, and for me in particular, this is the kind of issue that just really gets me, because it's so important and there's so much money in it, but it's so technical that everybody just sort of zones out. And this is, to throw in one of those pop culture references, this is, what Scott Adams, the writer of Dilbert, where you have
Harold, you got cut off in the middle of your reference to Dilbert, so I think I really want to hear that.
A thing Scott Adams referred to as the confuseopoly, where you have providers who basically confuse you and wear you out into submission. And this is a proceeding where we're talking about the telephone company, still largest embedded infrastructure, that has not changed, in part because all of the other infrastructures like cable, like wireless, are built on top of it and need to plug into each other and meet somewhere so they can exchange traffic. And we could have everybody keep building up the, tearing up the streets, building new networks, having some sort of competition for central offices and having networks that don't communicate with each other, or we have the one network which provides not just a place for interconnection, but also provides all of the existing lines and circuits that are necessary. So this is something that the FCC had actually regulated and price regulated very carefully until the beginning of the O's, when the FCC said, oh, shucks, competition should be coming around any minute now, except, of course, it didn't. And the decisions that the FCC made to continue to deregulate in this space contributed to the problem, so that we have now had an open proceeding for 10 years at the FCC of re-examining whether we did something wrong that is costing consumers billions of dollars on an annual basis. And we now finally have a chair of the FCC who wants to get this fixed before he leaves. We now have all of the pieces in place. So this is the big chance to actually make it happen. And ultimately, I would say the one thing I sort of think of, the amount of money that you pay extra for any kind of communication because of the high special access rates as a monopoly tax. It's a tax that is, instead of being paid to a government, is paid to CenturyLink or AT&T or Frontier or Verizon, whoever controls that essential facility. Because of a bad judgment call now 15 years ago, we've all been paying for it ever since. And we see this as the opportunity to get competition back on track, to get money back into the pockets of consumers that is going to pay these monopoly rates, we want to see this thing done.
Now, can I ask the audience, if you have any specific questions, please start submitting them. And let me suggest that one of them may be, hey, is this thing special access or is that thing special access? Because that may be able to prompt us to clear up some confusion. We've talked a little bit about what it is, and we're going to talk a little bit more now about what it is, what it includes and maybe what it does not include. But fundamentally, it's basically, as Maura was saying, it's a dedicated connection, and often is provided by the incumbent carrier, and in many cases without any real competition to discipline the market. Each of you panelists have heard the others talk a little bit about it. What other aspects of special access haven't we well defined yet in terms of what this includes?
Well, I would say that you've done a good job. It's difficult in some ways to put your mind around everything that's included here, because it's used as the base for everything from telemedicine. Hospitals need this, particularly where they want to do X-ray reviews, things that require high bandwidth. It's used for every ATM. It's used for credit card swipes in retail stores. It's used at the public library when you're for all kinds of things, obvious things. Schools. I mean, as President Obama has noted in his Connect Ed program, one of the kind of shocking problems in the United States is the lack of connectivity into schools. All of those connections are based on the infrastructure that Harold referred to. And up until 1996, there was one and only one provider in every location that had connections to all of those different places: hospitals, stores, businesses, schools. Every one of those locations was connected by one entity. And it probably wouldn't shock people to find out that despite the efforts of Congress to create competition in that space, those entities still control the vast majority of all those circuits, and it's the inability to get reasonable priced access to those circuits that prevents us from lowering the cost of services both for wireless and wireline alternatives.
And now, when I, as a home user, as a resident, if I'm getting a connection from the telephone company over, let's say, DSL, that is not special access in my home, right?
No, because it's a shared service. So you're buying, when you buy DSL, you're buying a service that commingles your traffic with other traffic. But you are going to ride, in part, special access circuits. So there are pieces of the network. Let me see if I can phrase it correctly. There are different parts of the network, and at some point you are going to get, even in DSL, you're going to get onto special access circuits. They are integral to the way in which all communications and broadband services are provided.
And we have a question here, which is one that I often have as well, and that's, is special access something that can only come from the incumbent providers, or, if we look at some of these middle mile networks that have been built, and some of the stimulus funds, for instance, and they're providing circuits now off of those. Are those special access?
Those are special access, yeah. So again, special access is not, it's not a complicated term. It's just dedicated transport. And yes, other people can deploy special access, and there are small companies who have done that, and there are larger companies. Sprint has deployed its own fiber rings in cities to allow us to distribute our traffic and to pick traffic up around the cities. The place in which you typically see the greatest bottleneck is in those last mile circuits. And the reason for that is simple economics. If you think of a typical city street with building after building after building after building running down a street, it's impractical to try and cut the road and cut the curb at every single building. But if you have one location at which you're picking up a lot of traffic, then you may build to that. And that's what most of what you refer to as middle mile is doing. The middle mile stuff is the larger aggregated pipes. The hardest part, the bottleneck, has always been getting from those middle mile facilities to individual consumer or business locations, or in the wireless space to a tower.
Yeah. This is Harold. I just want to tack on to that. I actually, interestingly enough, wrote a blog post about this in December of 2006, and part of what's going on here is that the FCC's idea when it deregulated 15 years ago was to say, well, we are expecting there's more overbuilding, so we expect there will be more competition. And the way the FCC arranged this was to loosen the rules in anticipation of, greater build out, more more opportunities, more providers of these long-haul circuits, and in those places where you can find that kind of dedicated transport, you unsurprisingly have lower prices. The problem was that the FCC moved too fast too soon, which had the effect of not just preserving existing monopoly pricing in places where the FCC had very loose definitions of what would constitute competition, but also allowed the existing providers to throttle the emergence of competition. So, the answer is, in theory, yes, there should be lots of competition for this, and the various overbuilding that people have done helps in particular ways, so that, but the fact is, when you get to the core of the network, and the reason why this is a business that generates, $20-something billion annually for the largest providers, is because in that core infrastructure, there still isn't choice. And if it had been possible for everybody else to get together and build out something lower cost, believe me, in the 10 years they've been waiting for the FCC to act, they would have.
And Maura, what exactly?
I would just add
Yep.
the numbers onto what Harold just said. In all this promise in the 90s has, fast forward to today, where we have 75% of Americans have no choice or just one option for broadband, as the FCC defines it, and 80% of all broadband subscriptions are controlled by a few dominant providers. So we've actually gone backwards.
And Maura, one of the things that when you and I have talked about this issue in the past, you've brought up is how little we actually know about this space. Can you just give us a sense of what data we have and why we have it and why we may not have what we need?
Well, the good news is that we finally do. There was something called ARMIS, and Charles and Harold will actually remember what that stands for, but the accounting data that the incumbent providers were required to give to the FCC, data that included these lines, they were able to get out from under in 2007. So we have not been able to look into that market since, though we know it has not gotten better, it's gotten worse, and it was pretty bad then. As far as I don't want to say the market collapsed, because the market was never really functioning competitively in the first place. As Harold said, it was deregulated on the hope that competition, or the expectation that competition was going to arrive, and it never did. So, the past, 8 to 10 years has been, I guess it's 8, this battle to get data on the market so that the FCC, that is a data-driven organization, can make the appropriate remedies once it sees what, the data on the markets itself. So that's actually been quite a long fight to try to get. And we finally have collected that data, that sort of bleeds into the urgency of this, because we are finally, after a long time of fighting this, in a position where we have data on the market, and a commission and a chairman that is willing to act in order to fix it and to bring relief.
Maura, I just wanted to jump in and underline that. Everyone understands that we each have our own reasons to be concerned about the market, and Sprint has its reasons, etc. But the important point here is that the Commission now has the data. Now, we haven't had an opportunity to see it yet, but it's expected to be released and available soon. And what I would want to emphasize to each of the members of the audience right now is that regardless of where you are in your thinking about this issue, this is something that costs cities a lot of money, either directly or indirectly. You may not even know that what you're buying is built with special access, but it costs you a lot of money.
And Charles, actually, I wanted to press into that. Let me just interrupt you for 1 second and see if, and I'll give you the mic back. I think one of the obvious things that comes to me is school districts might be impacted in 2 different ways. One is you have a connection often from the wider internet to one location in a school district. and that's one way. And then you have another connection connecting your various schools together so they can share that connection. And so you may actually be overpaying on two different ways. Is that right?
Yeah, and in fact, that's a good example of the confusion that I run into. So when I was talking to a group of folks that represented schools, and they made the comment to me, well, you know, I don't buy special access, I get E-rate. I buy services under E-rate through the E-rate program run by the FCC, so that's a different thing. And again, that's just a fundamental misconception. Sprint provides E-rate services. The way in which we provide E-rate services is we buy circuits from the incumbent carriers and then package that with other add-ons to allow connectivity through the cloud to those schools. So it's a building block of what we are selling to those schools. And if we were able to substantially reduce the cost of those building blocks, it would reduce the costs to the school.
And I think, you know, one thing that people have been familiar with over the years is this thing called the T1 line. And the T1 lines are, in many ways, had been special access entirely, and that's your dedicated line right there. So if you know, have had your local government, your first responders, anyone connected with a connection like that, that's special access. That's what we're talking about. And there's a question as to whether or not, you know, your police department budget should have to be picking up so extra cost.
Actually, yeah,
that's a great point, Chris.
Yeah, that's a great example, because that's another, all those 911 circuits, those are all dedicated special access transport, and the cost of 911 service is not just the connection, and you are paying the ILEC for to connect to their databases, but then every other carrier also is purchasing dedicated connections to that 911 database in order to deliver 911 traffic. So 911, you know, there's 7,000 PSAPs in the United States, and every carrier has to have multiple trunks into every one of those serving centers. You know, that's a lot of expense that's being borne just to provide that one service.
And I'm curious, Harold, can you tell us, is this something that has a different impact on rural or larger cities? Is it just kind of the same across the board?
Well, as with all things, the further you move out from the most populated areas, the fewer choices you have. It's just the standard economies of scale problem. Now, in some of the rural markets that are the smallest rural markets, they do still do some regulation. So when you look at the smaller carriers, you know, some of the smaller rural carriers, that may not be an issue. But in most rural areas where you're talking about CenturyLink, you know, or Frontier, or Windstream as the incumbent, or any of these guys who are the bigger companies, they've almost certainly gotten themselves out of you know, any kind of regulatory oversight tariffing that would really constrain the prices, and you're even less likely to have any kind of you know, competitors coming in. So you know, it's certainly an issue in the, you know, even in the largest urban markets, but it's also a case where the more rural you get, the harder you are going to be hit by you know, by the monopoly tax.
It's interesting that, frankly, in the past we've had a lot of rural telephone companies who you might think would be inclined to support kind of the incumbent point of view. We've had a lot of rural telephone companies support us in calling for closer oversight of this basic input, because while they may have their special access circuits in their territories, they're paying tremendous amounts of money to haul traffic from their territories to the basic peering points of the internet.
And I'm curious if, Maura, you can maybe tell us just a little bit about how this impacts the overall level of choice for local businesses, residents, you know, in terms of that world that Harold talked about that we wanted to live in, where there was a lot of choices. How does this impact that? I think we've touched on it, but just bring it home for us.
Yeah, I mean, the point, the end result is that you're trapped. You know, when broadband has seemingly so quickly, you know, gone from this new fancy thing to a necessity, to, you know, a utility-like service. It's not like a local business, rural or urban, has a choice even before you get to the provider. This is an essential facility. So they're going to have to pay whatever the provider is. The provider has all the control. When they're going to get it, how they're going to get it, how much they're going to pay for it. And the local business or anchor institution or startup or whoever it is just has to pay it. And, you know, the drag that creates over time on the economy is significant. I mean, as Harold said, you're talking about a lot of money that they'd be using to build out their businesses, jobs, you know, expansion, staying in more rural areas.
So just Maura and Harold, keep me honest here, but just in the most recent release, the FCC, who's the only ones at this point who've seen the most current data, they just got it in the beginning of this year. I think in their notice they just said they now estimate this market at $40 billion annually, which ain't small.
Right. So for those who haven't seen it, Harold has posted a link in the message in the software that we will put up on our website after the call that he referenced, and it links to a GAO report, a General or Government Accountability Office report. I wanted to, there's a question here that I think is interesting along the lines of, you know, questioning whether there can be true competition, facilities-based competition. And I'm kind of curious with this FCC proceeding, what kind of solution would we be expecting from the FCC, and would it depend on having competition in the market in ways that we've not seen it develop yet?
Well, this is Harold. Let me tackle that one first, which is what we found with the 1996 Act and the regulations that we had there with unbundling, with access to the essential elements, when we had a better access to these special access circuits, was that there are a lot of businesses that are interested in getting into this if they can find a way to do it. And what we've also found is that that has a virtuous cycle to it, which works much better than just trying to regulate and tariff, the specific end user end services, and that really the kind of most effective way to view this and to stimulate competition is to say, all right, what's the absolute, because it's always hard to regulate companies about stuff that they don't want to do, and you have to stay on top of it, but if you don't, then you get unregulated monopoly. So it's what's the way to target this in the right way? How do you, find the central points, the central points of failure in the infrastructure, the critical facilities, force those to be open, and then tell folks that they're going to build on top of that, and that's where the competition is going to come from. And that's what we're looking at here, is we're trying to basically hold open and expand the usability of those essential facilities that competitors build on. And if you expand that availability and make it more affordable, history shows that you get a lot more competitors.
We have a question about how this relates to low-income populations and whether it's related to Lifeline or not. And I guess my initial reaction is to say, well, if this is a $40 billion market and it's largely made up of charging ridiculous amounts of money rather than reasonable amounts, then presumably the costs would go down for everyone when you rectify that. But is that right, and is there anything else in terms of how it would relate to low-income populations?
I'll jump in, try to be brief. The Sprint is a provider of Lifeline services under the Assurance brand name, and we have, I don't know what our current counts are, about 2 to 3 million Lifeline customers at this point. Lifeline is a very, very low margin type business. Really, there's almost no margin there. In order to give people more as a part of that service, we need to be able to lower our cost structure. So to the extent that we can lower our cost structure, we can provide more and more robust offerings to those Lifeline customers. It's a direct correlation between our cost of operating a cell site and what we can provide to the end user customer, both in the Lifeline and in the traditional consumer model.
I think that's a really helpful reminder. I mean, when you're talking about those sort of low margin services, it makes a big difference whether or not you can get these to your towers and operate your business in as efficient a manner as possible. Maura, let me turn to you and ask you, as we're starting to get people a sense of what's happening next. What exactly is happening with the proceeding and happening at the FCC that people need to know about?
Well, I will leave it to Charles and Harold in the specifics of how the proceeding will unfold at the commission and the dates, but we'll say sort of as an overview, just to underscore what I said earlier about the sense of urgency. As we all know, politics is politics, and the closer we get to the presidential election in full swing, the window will get smaller very fast. Anybody in Washington who wants to get anything done on any issue, it will get very, very difficult after about May. So that does not leave a lot of time, even for a very willing and engaged FCC, to get this done. And as it represents so much money to the incumbents, they're going to fight it. So it's critical to get voices heard from throughout the broadband economy to say, yes, we need this done now. So we have created a campaign called Competify. It's trycompetify.com, where we have tried to distill this very technical conversation into one that is very simple to understand for a consumer and a business. And we've also tried to make it fun, because it is admittedly a little dry, where the underlying cause, the underlying disease is control over broadband access. So, sort of a la, with a nod to Saturday Night Live, though not as funny. Broadband access control is our disease, Competify is the cure. Because yes, with competition, sunlight is the best disinfectant, that all boats will rise when competition gets to the market. But the urgency is really key. And I'll kick it back to Charles to talk about what happens between now and November with the data, and they're also looking at terms and conditions, onerous terms and conditions on the contract side, how they lock in customers, and then where we go from there.
Well, so the next deadline is November 20th. The Commission has set that as the date by which we will all submit comments around the data that's been submitted. But I think the simple message that I want to again underscore is that now is the time to do something. The incumbent strategy from day one has been delay, delay, delay. Just prevent the commission from deciding anything. And our perspective is, you've got data. All you have to do is make a rational decision. You need to decide. You know, we believe the data will support what our perspective is, but now's the time to actually look at the data and do something with it. So I think it would be beneficial to everybody on the call to, at a minimum, simply say that more competition in broadband is really important to everyone in the economy, and you've got the tools now to act, so please do it. Get it done. This is the time to do it. This is the tipping point. Let's do something while we have the chance.
And that's it. Charles just articulated it very eloquently. I mean, we're not asking anybody to delve into the inner workings of special access.
So let me ask, sorry? Competition benefits everyone, if I had to guess. So in terms of what cities can do, I think, so cities could file comments with the FCC as to why this is important to them. But I'm also curious whether cities, you know, if there's an opportunity for cities to try and engage others or do so a little bit of something locally in terms of getting data from businesses that may be having bad experiences with special access or something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, yeah, God bless you, because that is really important. Stories, you know, making this real. Yes, we have a docket, and that's very important, and also just being able to you know, paint the picture of what this looks like. And it can be done, and it doesn't, you can have the horror stories, and you can also have, this is what we would do if the market were competitive. You know, this is what our community could offer our citizens if, you know, we weren't spending all this money to line the pockets of a couple of companies. This is how we can keep, this is how economic development, this is how we can keep people in our communities, you know, yada, yada, yada.
And I'm curious if, sorry, Harold, I just have one thing that bursts into my head. Some of our cities, a number of them, are already service providers. And I've heard stories along the lines of, you know, the school was paying X amount for a 45 megabit DS3, you know, a 45 megabit connection on special access. And we decided as a community to build fiber to them. And we decided to give them a gig at that same price because we could do it, and we knew that they could afford that. And we did that. And then the provider came back and undercut us and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, those are the kind of stories you're looking for, right? That kind of data that proves there's a problem in the market.
That is more compelling, Chris, than, you know, anything that we could do on the communication side. I mean, stories matter. And that just sort of sums it up right there.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fabulous example. I mean, and I know that a lot of cities too, and have worked, for example, to build Wi-Fi networks within their city. But of course, all that Wi-Fi has to sit on something. So the Wi-Fi part's actually easy. The expensive part is connecting the Wi-Fi. And so again, it's integral to a lot of city missions.
It's like you get rid of a bottleneck at one point in the network, and that works maybe for a little while until you hit the next bottleneck in the network. So with the Wi-Fi example, that's wonderful until you need a dedicated broadband line.
Well, I just want to add one more point to this. Is we've talked a lot about broadband, but this is also true for every department store that is running a whole bunch of cash registers and credit card readers. You know, there are a lot of businesses that are dependent on this stuff and pay for it and just accept it as the way the world is. And I think that you know, if you talk to businesses about what their communications costs are and how they're using this stuff, you will find that businesses that you don't think of as communications businesses are really impacted by this stuff in a big way.
Excellent. What are some places people can go? We're going to collect resources to put on our page, but what are some of the places people could go to learn a little bit more about this?
I would urge them to first start with trycompetify.com, which is the campaign website that can, walk through, how to contact the FCC, what the issue is, what the stats are, how to get more involved, who's involved already. Harold has a number of very good blog posts and maybe even a paper or two on the Public Knowledge website, which is publicknowledge.org. CompTel is a trade association that has comptel.org, which has also been active in this area. And certainly, absolutely feel free to contact any one of us if you need more detailed explanation or want to share stories, whatever we can do to be helpful.
Excellent. We have a few more minutes. We can end early, but let me just make sure that people have a chance to submit any final questions. I will strongly encourage communities that have that can share any stories about this kind of sudden change in pricing that demonstrates market failure, I think, in my mind. Share those with me or Deb, and we can get them in the right hands or connect you with the people that can try and get the story out. I think it's something that we all benefit by telling those kinds of stories. Deb, is there anything that's been popping into your head as we roll up?
No, I love the idea of sharing stories. We've got a lot of great stories to share, and I think, I agree with Maura, it's very compelling to hear the story. The data itself is really helpful, but the stories help to make it feel real. So if you have stories, please share them, and we will make sure to help amplify them. And again, we'll have a lot of these resources that folks are talking about on our website under resources, so please do go there and take a look. I hope that's helpful to everybody to hear. And this has been recorded, and so we will also be sharing this audio tape and the webinar with all of our members. And I recommend that you share this information and encourage other folks to listen in so that they have a sense of what this issue is and how it impacts them. I think that for a lot of us at the city level, this was a somewhat quiet issue, and we need to make it much louder and amplify it the way that it's impacting our cities.
And let me ask our panelists, do you have any final comments you'd like to share?
Well, I'll just close by saying that if you hear a certain passion in my voice, it's because this is an issue that has long been recognized as a problem, but has never been dealt with. It's been swept under the rug, and there's a limited window here. So, boy, it would be really great if folks can take a little time to look into their own expenses and talk to the FCC. Say something now, because otherwise we just won't get this solved.
What is the line? If you see something, say something.
Yeah, I'll just add, one of the biggest problems for consumers is what I call the nickel and diming of America, where in the aggregate, for any individual consumer, the amount that this is adding is relative to their bill is relatively small and relatively hard to understand. But in the aggregate, it's a huge drag on everybody. And this is, as Charles said, it's a real problem with regard to everybody knows there's a problem, and nobody's managed to muster the will to do something. We now actually have somebody who's willing to take on the biggest incumbents and try to do something. And now we got to, give them what they need in order to get it over the finish line.
Which is quite extraordinary if you think about it. All of the polling and focus grouping of consumers on the issue of broadband choice is surprising in that everybody knows, everybody's mad, everybody knows what's going on, but consumers feel powerless to do anything about it. here is one rare instance where consumers and businesses can do something, and they can support the FCC in its willingness to fix it. And that opportunity doesn't come about very often. So it's a unique circumstance in which your voice really matters.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us. We're going to continue spreading the word about it and see what kind of data we can dig up, what great stories we can dig up. But I'm glad that we've all learned much more about it. I know that I have. Deb, you can take us home, please.
Thank you, and I have learned a lot as well. I really appreciate the time you've spent helping us understand how this impacts us personally, our cities, our businesses. So thank you so much for that. And again, folks, I hope you will spread the word, and please do look at the resources on our website. And I appreciate your being here, and thanks to all our panelists, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks very much.
Take care.